All right, engineers, so in this video, we are going to talk about endoderm. Before we go ahead and get started, please make sure you hit that like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. If you guys want to support us, please, down in the description box, we'll have links to our Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon. If you guys want to donate, we would truly appreciate it. All right, Ninja Nerds, let's get into it. All right, Ninja Nerds, so let's talk about the endoderm. First thing we have to talk about is how we actually develop the endoderm. I know you guys know this because we've talked about it countless times. We're going to really kind of blow through this. If you guys remember, we start off with what? What was this? Our bilaminar disc. The bilaminar disc consists of what layers? The epiblast, which was your top layer, and above that is the amniotic cavity, and then the hypoblast, which is below the epiblast, and then below that is the actual yolk sac. Remember what happens, you get kind of a what? A little primitive streak that forms right here in the epiblast, and then those actual epithelial cells, or epiblast cells, will start moving down through that, right? And whenever they do that, those epiblast cells, as they move through that primitive streak, what do we say they do? Well, they first move down, and whenever they move down, they replace the hypoblast and turn this into endoderm. Then they make a new layer between the epiblast and the hypoblast. What is this layer? This is your mesoderm. And then eventually, what happens is the epiblast cells themselves differentiate and form what's called ectoderm. So we start off with our bilaminar disc forming a trilaminar disc. This is called what step? This is called gastrulation, right? And there's also the process of making the notochord. We've already discussed this like 10 million times, and I know you guys know it. But just to quickly recap it, the difference between that is that the epiblast cells move through the primitive node and then make that tubular process that extends towards the prochordal plate. Now, if we kind of take and look at this trilaminar disc that we made, I want us to look at this in two different types of sections. One is we're going to look at this in a cross section, and then the other way we're going to look at this is a sagittal section. Okay? Why that's important is it's going to give you kind of some anatomical understanding of the development, particularly of the gut tube, which is derived from your endoderm. So here's our cross section, and again, we're just going to label it here ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. Right? And then here is going to be your neural tube, which is in that maroon color, and then black is the notochord. Above here is your amniotic cavity, and then below here is going to be your yolk sac. What happens, we already know this, you go through a process called lateral folding. And that lateral folding process is where the edges of the ectoderm start moving this way. Some of the mesoderm moves this way. And then the endoderm kind of moves this way. And it kind of like hugs itself. And when it kind of hugs itself, what happens? It makes this type of configuration, this kind of cross section of the embryo. And what we see here is something very interesting. If you take a look here, what do we have here? We got our neural tube right here. Here we have our paraxial mesoderm. Here we have our intermediate mesoderm. And then here you have your lateral plate mesoderm, somatic layer, lateral plate mesoderm, splanchnic layer. This blue layer kind of hugging around this entire kind of component of the embryo is going to be your ectoderm. And then what is this kind of green structure here that's kind of made like a tube here? This is going to be your endoderm. Now, why this is important is you can kind of see the configuration of that gut tube. You're only seeing a cross section of it. So because you only see just a portion of it throughout the actual length of the GI tract, it's actually better and easier to see the endoderm and how it actually really looks in a sagittal section. It's a lot easier because you can derive these different components of the endoderm and really section it off into what's called foregut, midgut, and hindgut. So, just so you understand, cross section, lateral folding gives you this kind of component, which is good for looking at the cavities, right? And one section of the gut tube, which is derived from the endoderm. But the sagittal section is a lot better for understanding the derivations of the endoderm. So here we have a sagittal section. Again, what is this layer here? Ectoderm. What is this layer here? Mesoderm. And then what is the actual green layer? This is your endoderm. And again, here is your yolk sac, and here is your amniotic cavity. How I want you to think about this in this configuration is that this is the cranial end, and this is the caudal end. Okay? Now, at the cranial end, if you guys remember, there's kind of like a fusion point of the ectoderm and the endoderm, and they make two different types of membranes. We'll talk about them a little later, called the buccopharyngeal membrane and the cloacal membrane. This becomes the mouth, that becomes the doo-doo hole, right? The anal canal. So what happens in this configuration is a lot easier to see. You go through folding. So now again, same process. Amniotic cavity is going to come around, mesoderm will fold, and then the actual endoderm will fold. This is called craniocaudal folding. Pretty straightforward, right? And what it does is it gives this really nice kind of anatomical figure of the endoderm, the gut tube. This right here, when we look at it, this gut tube is really what I want us to look at and look at what it derives into, right? And this layer here is our endoderm. That's what I want us to focus on. Now, again, the gut tube is connected to the yolk sac, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. All right, but again, big thing I want you to remember is bilaminar to trilaminar is gastrulation. That's how we get our endoderm from the hypoblast. And if we look at the endoderm and how it actually forms the gut tube and the cross section and sagittal section via the lateral folding and craniocaudal folding, you get a cross section at one point of the gut tube. But if you want to look at the entire length of the gut tube, the best anatomical way is the sagittal section when it goes through craniocaudal folding. So now let's take and look at this gut tube, pull it out and see what it actually divides into. So now what I want us to talk about is some of the derivatives of the endoderm, okay? First thing I want us to do is let's go ahead and take and look at this actual gut tube. What section is this? This is our sagittal section. From this gut tube, right, you have three components. I'm gonna kind of slice them off here and slice them off here. This right here is called your foregut. It's at the actual most cranial portion. So here's going to be the cranial end of the embryo, and here's the caudal end of the embryo. Okay? Here is going to be the midgut, and here is going to be the hindgut. We'll talk a little bit later. There's also another structure called the cloaca, and we'll talk about what that actually becomes. But for right now, I want you to imagine here's this gut tube. I'm just kind of yanking it out of this and only isolating that gut tube. And so now we have the gut tube from cranial to caudal. And what I want us to do is understand what happens to the foregut, what happens to the midgut, and what happens to the hindgut. Foregut is going to be at the most cranial portion. Think about what aspects of the GI tract you're going to make at the top. Well, we have what structure here? The esophagus and even the pharynx. So first you have a little bit of the pharynx. So you start pharynx is the beginning part. Then you have what else? The esophagus. What else? The stomach. And what else? The actual first two parts of the duodenum, right? So you're going to have the first two parts of the duodenum, or duodenum, however you want to pronounce it, that's fine. Okay, but that's the beginning parts of the foregut. So far we know what the endoderm has actually made. Again, endoderm is this, it's going to be basically forming the epithelial lining of our gut tube. And what structures of the gut tube? So far the foregut, we have these organs. Now we come to the midgut. Just continue down. It's really easy if you think about the path of the GI tract. Take a piece of food and follow it all the way down. Pharynx, esophagus, stomach, first two parts of the duodenum. What's left? The last two parts of the duodenum. Okay, so the last two parts, because there's four parts of the duodenum, right? So last two parts of the duodenum are again, duodenum, whatever. And then what's after that? Then you go jejunum. So you have your jejunum. And then what happens after that? Then you have your ileum. And then keep going. What do you have after that? So again, you got jejunum. Ileum is going to be closest to the cecum. Then after the cecum, you have the ascending colon. So you have your ascending colon. And then what else? So you have ascending colon and you get to the transverse colon. What aspect of the transverse colon? So for that aspect of the transverse colon, it's going to be the first or the proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon. So proximal, 2/3 of transverse colon. All right. Sweet. So we've talked about so far foregut, midgut, which is basically going to be what derives from the epithelial lining of your gut tube. These things so far. Now come to the most caudal portion of that gut tube, which again is endoderm lined. This is your hindgut. What do we have left? Follow it. Transverse colon, you have the proximal 2/3. What's left? The distal 1/3. So now I have the distal 1/3 of the colon. What part? Transverse colon. Then we have the descending colon. And then we have the sigmoid colon, right? So you have descending colon, sigmoid colon. What's after the sigmoid colon? The rectum, and then your anal canal. But we'll talk about what aspect of the anal canal in a second. But again, I want you to remember sigmoid, colon, and then the last part is going to be the rectum and the anal canal. But we'll kind of go a little bit more on the anal canal because it's actually a very specific part of the anal canal. Okay, so far we've pretty much say what the endoderm derived into, all the epithelial lining of the gut tube from the foregut, midgut, hindgut. Now, let's talk about some other things which are very interesting, which are budding off of the gut tube or developing from what's called the primitive pharynx. So we've talked about the development from particularly what happens to the endoderm, right? Remember, endoderm is the epithelial lining of that gut tube. We talked about all the things that develop from that foregut, midgut, hindgut. There's another thing. If we go up to the top, right, of the top here of the foregut, there's an area called the primitive pharynx. We're going to cut through that portion. And what happens is if you cut through it, it kind of looks like this. So this is kind of going to be like the area of what's called our primitive pharynx. Okay, because obviously the pharynx itself will develop from that foregut. But what happens is this primitive pharynx starts kind of having, again, what is this layer here? Remember we said that there's a portion where the ectoderm and the endoderm fuse together. What is this called? We're going to abbreviate it, but this is called our buccopharyngeal membrane. That's where the mouth is going to be, right? Then what happens is here's the ectoderm lining the outer part, here's the endoderm lining the inner part, and the mesoderm here in the middle. What happens is you start to form these kind of like vesiculations here. And this gives way to what's called the pharyngeal apparatus. Again, we're going to go through the pharyngeal arches and what they develop into, their development in another video. But for right now, what I want you to know is that the pharyngeal apparatus is basically going to have endoderm on the inner aspect of it. So here, this is all that endoderm lining the inner aspect of the pharyngeal apparatus, which is derived from the primitive pharynx. On the inner aspect, so here's your ectoderm, here's the mesoderm here in the center. On the inner aspects, you see these portions here where it kind of comes in right here? These kind of form little pouches called pharyngeal pouches. And we'll talk about these later, but they can form like different components, like a dorsal and a ventral pouch. We'll talk about those pouches a little bit later. But for right now, what I want you to remember is that these pouches, a couple of them, they will actually derive from the first pharyngeal pouch, the second, the third, the fourth, into these structures here. What are some of those structures? All right, so if we have this first pharyngeal pouch, right? So here's our first pharyngeal pouch, second pharyngeal pouch, third pharyngeal pouch, and fourth pharyngeal pouch. These pouches, we're not going to go into the different components of these, but they will derive into these structures here that we have below. The first pharyngeal pouch will actually form two components here. One is called your middle ear, right? Or basically your tympanic kind of cavity here. And then the other one is the auditory tube, or also known as your auditory tube, which is also known as your eustachian tube. So auditory tube or eustachian tube. That's derived from the first pharyngeal pouch. The second pharyngeal pouch will form what's called your tonsils, and you got a ton of these dang things. To give you a hit of some of them, you got your tubal tonsils, you got your pharyngeal tonsils, also known as your kind of like your adenoids. You have your lingual tonsils, and you also have your palatine tonsils. Okay, all of these are derived from your second pharyngeal pouch. Now the third and the fourth one, these can be a little bit more complicated. We'll go over this in more detail. And again, the pharyngeal apparatus video. But your third and your fourth pharyngeal pouch derive into a couple different structures. One is they derive in what's called to the superior parathyroid gland. This one into the inferior parathyroid gland. And they also derive into what's called your parafollicular cells or your C cells. So again, you got your superior parathyroid gland, inferior parathyroid gland, and your C cells. And also, from the primitive pharynx, you also have this kind of bud that comes off of it. This bud's from that primitive pharynx, and this is going to make your thyroid. Okay? So again, just to remind you, again, the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches here are going to give way to your superior parathyroid, your inferior parathyroid, and your C cells, your parafollicular cells. There is another one, if you guys want to remember this kind of actually is in the neck and then it moves down into your chest. It's called your thymus gland. So if you actually want to add in one more, don't forget about that good old thymus. But these are going to be all derived from your third and fourth pharyngeal pouch. The thyroid is derived kind of a budding off of the primitive pharynx. All right, but these are the things that are going to be derived from parts of your pharyngeal apparatus. Now, I want to talk about some organs that actually bud off of the foregut. So we talked about, again, some of the structures that derive from the endoderm-lined pharyngeal apparatus, which is, again, derived from that primitive pharynx. The next thing I want you to know is that going again back to that foregut, okay, so again, this is going to be our foregut. We already talked about the structures that are coming from the foregut. Actually, again, imagine the endoderm is the epithelial lining of this gut tube. Coming off of this gut tube, some of the endoderm cells kind of move into these little pouches and also help to make other structures, GIT associated organs, let's call them. What are these like little pouches or buds that come off of them? One is called the respiratory bud or the respiratory diverticulum. The other one is called the hepatic bud or the hepatic diverticulum. And then the other one is called the pancreatic bud or the pancreatic diverticulum. These, obviously their names pretty much give you the answer. From these buds, the endoderm can move into these little buds and help to make what structures? Your respiratory tract, right? So your respiratory tract. Obviously your trachea, your bronchi, the parenchyma of the lungs, all of that good stuff. The hepatic diverticulum is also going to be helpful for making the liver and even the gallbladder or the biliary system. Now, even a little bit of the hepatic diverticulum gives way to the head. Again, we'll talk about these in later videos too, but the head of the pancreas can also come from the hepatic diverticulum, and then the remaining body and tail come from the pancreatic diverticulum. But either way, all of these buddings coming off of the foregut give way to these structures. So again, this is also endoderm derived. All right? All right, so the last part that I want to talk about is how we actually can take endoderm and derive other structures, particularly the bladder, the urethra, and the inferior aspect of the anal canal. We already talked a little bit about the inferior anal canal. We'll talk about it again in a second. Remember, we have the sagittal section. So here's cranial, and here is caudal. And again, we already talked about these membranes where the ectoderm and the endoderm directly fuse. What are these areas here? This is called your buccopharyngeal membrane. And again, what do we say what happens when this actually breaks down? What does this become? The mouth. And then this one is called your cloacal membrane. And the cloacal membrane, once this breaks down, this actually becomes two structures. Your drainer and your stainer, okay? It's going to become the actual urethra, and it's also going to become the anal canal. Right? So easy way to remember that is your drainer and your stainer, okay? So that is going to be something that we have to talk about a little bit. So how does the cloacal membrane, because we already talked about the buccopharyngeal membrane, how does the cloacal membrane form the urethra and the anal canal? And actually, more particularly, there's another aspect that actually comes and feeds into this urethra, and that's going to be the bladder. So let's take and zoom in on this portion here and look at it. If we look at this portion here at the bottom, we had foregut, midgut, hindgut, and we said that this bottom part here is called the cloaca. So here we're going to have that hindgut portion coming into the cloaca. what happens is the cloaca has this little kind of structure here called the allantois. Don't worry about that right now. But this portion here called the cloaca, guess what happens? It starts actually bifurcating. So it kind of breaks into two portions. One portion is going to move anteriorly and the other portion is going to move posteriorly. So now look how this right here was one whole kind of like sac. Now it splits into two portions. This anterior portion is going to be called the urogenital sinus. Which one is this one? Anterior. This one here is posterior. This is going to be the anal canal, basically. Okay? So that is what I want you to remember. Now, once it does this, what's going to happen? This urogenital sinus will actually lead to the formation of a couple structures. Again, we're going to go into this in more detail in the renal system. But for right now, what I want you to remember is that the urogenital sinus will help to make what structure? The bladder, the urethra, and in males, the prostate gland. So again, what structures are going to be derived from that urogenital sinus? It is going to be the bladder, the urethra, which obviously in males there's multiple parts to that urethra. And then also in males there's going to be the prostate gland. Beautiful, right? Now, the anal canal, right, which is going to be in the posterior aspect, which was derived from the cloaca. That, you see how, again, we have ectoderm, endoderm, which are kind of connecting with one another? Well, some of the ectoderm kind of moves in. And when it does this, it actually kind of forms this like nice, beautiful separation in the anal canal. So you have this kind of pink structure that I drew here. This here is called your pectinate line. It's called your pectinate line. And what the pectinate line is it separates beautifully the endoderm-derived portion of the anal canal and the ectoderm-derived portion of the anal canal. Isn't that cool? So the ectoderm is going to be below the pectinate line, and the endoderm is going to be above the pectinate line. So that is why I wanted to say something specific about the anal canal back there, that the two-thirds, the superior two-thirds of the anal canal is actually going to be endoderm derived. And then the inferior third of the anal canal is going to be ectoderm derived. All right, so the last thing that I want to do here is come up with a little mnemonic. It's not amazing, but it'll give you the basic things that you need to know for the endoderm, what structures are derived from it. And it's just remembering endo. Okay, so E is the epithelial lining of the GIT. And that includes anything from the pharynx all the way down to that superior two-thirds of the anal canal. So that covers all of that. The other stuff is just remember kind of some of the stuff that's in the neck. What are some of those structures that we talked about that were in the neck? Just to mention a couple of them. Your thyroid, your thymus, and your parathyroid glands, right? Those are some of them. Obviously it doesn't cover the tonsils and it doesn't cover the auditory tube, but it gets you some of them. The next one is your drainer, okay? So you gotta remember that good old drainer. And that covers what? Your bladder and your urethra, okay? And then O is the organs associated with the GI tract. So the organs kind of associated with the GI tract. And those were things that are derived from those actual diverticulum or buds, which was the respiratory tract, which was your liver, your gallbladder, and your pancreas. It doesn't give you all of it, but it gives you a good amount to remember some of the derivations of the endoderm. All right, engineers, so in this video, we talk about the endoderm. I hope it made sense and I hope you guys did like it. All right, engineers, as always, until next time.